We have been journeying through Habakkuk, and it's such a great little book. So much in there for 3 short chapters. There's a lot condensed into that book, and I love it so much, and we've been having a good time going through it. So we are now going to be over halfway through at the end of today. So praise God for that, for patience, for endurance, and for all that He's been teaching us along the way. But we are in Habakkuk chapter 2. We're going to read from verse 5 to verse 14. So that's where we're going to start at today. So we'll read the text, and then we'll come back to it and go verse by verse. So Habakkuk chapter 2, starting at verse 5, this is a reading from the word of the Lord. Yea, also, because he transgresseth by wine, he is a proud man, neither keepeth at home, who enlargeth his desire as hell, and is as death, and cannot be satisfied, but gathereth unto him all nations, and heapeth unto him all people. Shall not all these take up a parable against him, and a taunting proverb against him, and say, Woe to him that increaseth that which is not his? How long? And to him that ladeth himself with thick clay. Shall they not rise up suddenly that shall bite thee, and awake that shall vex thee, and thou shalt be for booties unto them? Because thou hast spoiled many nations, all the remnant of the people shall spoil thee, because of men's blood, and for the violence of the land, of the city, and of all that dwell therein. Woe to him that coveteth an evil covetousness to his house, that he may set his nest on high, that he may be delivered from the power of evil. Thou hast consulted shame to thy house by cutting off many people, and hast sinned against thy soul. For the stone shall cry out of the wall, and the beam out of the timber shall answer it. Woe to him that buildeth the town with blood, and establisheth the city by iniquity. Behold, is it not of the Lord of hosts that the people shall labor in the very fire, and the people shall weary themselves for very vanity? For the earth shall be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea. Herein ends the reading of God's word. Again, we're going to start the verse 5, and just kind of work our way through this. I did entitle this Singing Over Babylon's Defeat. This is part 1, because the rest of the chapter will be part 2 next week. What's really, why I say this is Singing Over Babylon's Defeat is because the prophet cast this in a specific liturgical form, or a certain song form, a funeral dirge. And what it is, it's a parody. It is the people celebrating beforehand the defeat of Babylon, because again, Babylon is the one who they're guilty of extortion, they're guilty of pillaging, they're guilty of murder, they're guilty of kidnapping, and they just come in and conquer the land. And remember, again, this is a response all the way back to the people of Israel and Judah and their sin against God. Habakkuk cries out, why? And how long am I going to endure this? And God says, don't worry, I'm going to punish them with the Babylonians. And then Habakkuk says, how in the world can you use the Babylonians to punish people that are not as bad as themselves? And then God gives an answer and says that the just shall live by faith. And that precedes all of this. And so now God is predicting the downfall and punishment of Israel's enemies. Now, what's interesting in all of this is we're going to see that the principle that we reap what we sow, right? That whatever is sown, that one day it's going to have a harvest, and it's time to put the sickle in. And God is saying that everything that this nation does is going to be turned back on its own head. That is a universal principle that is at work in God's creation, because that's how God created it. Is that we reap what we sow. We reap righteousness, we reap righteousness. We sow iniquity, we reap iniquity, and so on. If we sow violence, we receive violence. Jesus said, if you live by the sword, you'll die by the sword. It's just a certain principle that we can't escape. And what's interesting here, we have a very poetic description of the downfall of Babylon. Verse 5 is sort of like an introduction into everything that's going to be said. He says, yea, also, because he transgresseth by wine, he is a proud man, neither keepeth at home, who enlargeth his desire as hell, and is as death, and cannot be satisfied. But gathereth unto him all nations, and heapeth unto him all people. And we're going to include in part of that the first part of verse 6. Shall not all these take up a parable against him and a taunting proverb against him and say, and then he begins to enter into the woes. Now, what's interesting here is that the idea of drunkenness and intoxication is the prophet's, it's a metaphorical sense, in which these guys, this nation, is drunk on victory. Everywhere they go, they meet the people. They get up in the morning just to look for a new nation to conquer. It is never enough. They are never pacified, never satisfied. Their violence and their sin knows no bounds. And so the prophet is just explaining who they are, characterizing them overall for their violent actions. He says that he is a proud man. He doesn't stay at home, meaning he never finds rest. He's never satisfied. He never finishes his day's work and say, okay, I finished my work, I can relax and be done. He says, no. These people say, there's another nation there that we haven't conquered yet. I mean, could you imagine that? Just waking up saying, hey, we haven't killed those people yet. We got to go do that. But that is the case for Babylon. And we think about that, I mean, in our own day. People who have power don't want to let go of it. They're insatiable. They want more. People who just live for extending their reach, extending their influence. We see it in politics and politicians. We see it national. We see it local. We see it all over the place. The corruption that takes place. George Washington, one of my favorite historical figures, I love the fact that after 2 terms, they wanted him to run again for president, and he said, absolutely not. He said, I won't do it. And that's where he said the wonderful phrase that we all know about power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And he said no. He said the longer you stay in that position, it's going to corrupt at some point. The way our founding fathers looked at government was it was a necessary evil. It wasn't necessarily a good thing. It was something that we have to have. We have to have government. But they understood at the very beginning that the more people grasp for power, the more they will step on the backs and the necks of people underneath them to establish that power and keep that power. And they'll never be content. And that's what Habakkuk is saying. Is that this nation, just enough was never enough. They are as greedy as the grave and as in death itself. There is no satiating it. There is no stopping it. But what's interesting is in verse 6 how it says, shall not all these take up a parable against thee and a taunting proverb against him? All right, so Babylon is not only going to be the literal Babylon, but anybody, any nation, any individual who sets themselves up and lives opposed to God's will and law and ways in the world. This is God's creation. You can't live in contrast to it or in opposition to it and not expect certain things to happen. And so Babylon stands as more than just a nation, but for anybody who would oppose God. So they will be a taunting proverb and a parable. So a lot of what he says is going to apply to any person or any nation who tries to live outside of God's boundaries. So then we enter into these cycle of 3 woes. Next week there will be 2 more woes. But it ends in verse 14 with a promise of God's glory and his kingdom reigning. And these woes, they have a characteristic form. It begins by declaring the wrong that the person committed, and then it ends with the judgment that God will make sure happens to them. Woe number 1. I call this from victor to victim. This is verses 6 through 8. Verse 6, down to the first woe. Woe to him that increaseth that which is not his. How long? And to make him that ladeth himself with thick clay. Now what the prophet's talking about here is Babylon amassed their wealth and their possessions and their resources at the expense of other people. It wasn't theirs. They took it. They took it as they came in and disposed people and killed people. They would take their possessions to belong to themselves. So they're thieves. And then the reference to thick clay, what that's referring to is a pledge that somebody makes when they're living in debt. They would make a pledge saying that I will pay the rest if you just give me time. Okay? And what Babylon did was they would just oppress people and pile debt upon debt upon debt till they couldn't live underneath that weight of debt. They were slaves, economic slaves to the Babylonian Empire. Right? You always got to do is mention that word taxes. And it makes you start wondering. taxes and taxes and taxes and taxes. That's what they were doing. They were taxing the people. It was a form of extortion. And they put them in a hole that they couldn't dig themselves out. And that's the idea of the thick clay. It's a Hebrew word play. The word pledge is also a word that's very synonymous with thick clay. And if you've ever had to work with thick clay, actually I was digging in some yesterday. We put in a drain for a local church over in New Mine. And, you get into clay, man, that stuff is hard to work with. Even the big equipment that has all the pneumatics and the power and everything, you get into a big mess of clay. Even them, sometimes that equipment has a hard time digging through that stuff. And if you ever get stuck in wet clay, oh man, is that hard to get out of. You pull your boots off and you try to pull your foot out, it just seems like no matter what you do, you stick your hand down, now it's stuck. And that's what he's talking about. A debt that just pulls the people down and they can't get out of. And he's saying, this is what you do. This is how you amass your wealth. You took it from people when you imposed debts that they can't climb out from underneath. Verse 7, shall they not rise up suddenly that shall bite thee, and awake thee that shall vex thee, and thou shalt be for booties unto them? He says, don't you realize at some point the victor is going to become the victim? At some point these people are going to be tired of being oppressed and having your neck or your boot on their necks, and they're going to say one day, why do we take this? Even in verse 8, he continues, he says, because thou hast spoiled many nations, all the remnant of the people shall spoil thee, because of men's blood and for the violence of the land of the city, and of all that dwell therein. He's saying, even all those who are left over at some point are going to shake off all this apathy and lethargy and say, wait a minute, why do we take this? Why do we stand for this? In God's judgment, God will raise up the very victims who are being oppressed to conquer their oppressors. And that happens all throughout history, right? We see that all throughout every big empire. It ends up, rebellion ends up choking the empire. God only lets it endure for so long. So, Babylon will have their blood spilt, so to say, by those they sought to bleed. That's kind of what he's saying there, that the people shall spoil thee because of men's blood and the violence of the land and of the city and of all that dwell therein. He's saying, and as he's referring, it's all metaphorical. He's referring to the economical hardships that they're impressing on the people. They're going to rise up and they're going to take back what belongs to them. At some point, God is going to reverse the fortunes, and you are going to be now the victim. Which leads us into the second woe. And I call this from untouchable to accountable. These are verses 9 through 11. He says, woe to him that coveteth an evil covetousness to his house, that he may set his nest on high, that he may be delivered from the power of evil. And this is the picture of, if you've ever seen an eagle's nest, they put them up in places that you just can't get to. And they're massive. They are huge nests, these things that these beautiful birds build. And they put them up in places where no one else can reach them. Their eaglets are secure from anything in the world. And this is the picture of Babylon. Is Babylon put themselves in a mountain fortress and considered themselves untouchable. We can't be touched. We're walled in. Their walls were so big they had 100 bronze gates on them, and the wall was thick enough that a 4-horse chariot could drive across the top of it. That is an amazing feat. So they thought, okay, we're untouchable. And what's interesting is what the prophet says. He says that he may be delivered from the power of evil. And the phrase that he's using is actually referencing that the same evil that they perpetrated against other nations, they're afraid somebody else is going to do to them. Think about that. That's what a lot of people do in their wickedness, is what people do is they, like, whatever they're guilty of, they're sure to make sure that they're not touched by the same guilt that they do. If they trample on people, if they lie to people, they make sure that other people won't lie to them. They can't stand it. They don't want people to lie to them. They can be a compulsive liar, and nothing they say, you can't trust it. Their mouth is crooked. Everything that comes out is skewed. But man, they can't stand that in somebody else. Or a very proud person can't stand other proud people. Because a proud person is, it's not, I want to be wealthier. I don't want to be just wealthy. I want to be wealthier than you, right? I don't want to be attractive. I want to be more attractive than you. Everything is about